Disease-ridden swamps, little more than a muddy, slimy, smelly, unproductive waste of space and water. For many years, this was society's attitude towards wetlands and directed policies that overtook mile upon mile of irreplaceable wonders. More recently, the intrinsic value and remarkable natural bounty of wetlands is gaining greater currency in society at large, though wetlands are still being destroyed at an astonishing pace. As more people begin to understand and appreciate the impact and significance of wetlands, the abolition of this fragile ecosystem may cease in remembrance of the beautiful world we have forgotten. Wetlands provide many services to both waterfowl and other marsh organisms, including sites for breeding, migration, rest stops, habitat, food, water, and sediment filtration. They also provide an important aesthetic and recreational resource.
Well, wetlands are important for a number of reasons. One of the primary reasons that's often cited is its role in water quality. Wetlands serve a primary function of filtering water as it moves from upland areas down to lower elevation, lowland areas. Wetlands also provide a very important role for wildlife. There are many wildlife species that are dependent upon wetlands, particularly the ones that come to most people's mind first are waterfowl, shorebirds. But those species are very dependent. They spend most of their life cycle requirements are tied with wetlands. There are also a number of other species that are tied to wetlands, a lot of aquatic insects that provide food and forage for passerine birds. Some of the greatest threats that are associated with wetlands is really agricultural development, urban development, the encroaching development on these wetlands. There's the continued pressure to drain them to allow for that type of development to occur.
Throughout the years, several laws and policies have been enacted to preserve the wetlands and marshes of North America, and the United States in particular. These include, among others, the Clean Water Act, Wetland Bank Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the North American Wetland Conservation Act, also known as Nawca. Nawca has conserved over 23 million acres of marsh habitat and has funded more than 1,800 projects. Distribution of funding varies among the three countries received Nawca grants, with the United States receiving 50%, Mexico 5%, and Canada 45%.
Hi, I'm Craig Garner. I'm the regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited, and I'm responsible for delivering wetland conservation programs here in Utah and eastern Nevada. And the Great Salt Lake is extremely important for waterfowl, shorebirds, and other wading birds. Annually, the Great Salt Lake supports roughly 4 million waterfowl and another 4 to 5 million shorebirds and waterbirds. One of the programs that Ducks Unlimited is very involved with in conserving wetlands around the Great Salt Lake is a federal funding program called North American Wetlands Conservation Act, or NACA for short. The North American Wetlands Conservation Act was created in 1989 by Congress to conserve and support wetland conservation programs across the United States. Here in Utah, Ducks Unlimited is a driving force behind NACA grants. Utah has been awarded 8 NACA grants in the past, conserving over 55,000 acres of wetlands associated with the Great Salt Lake. Before Ducks Unlimited can submit for a NACA grant, the first step is to meet with private landowners and state partners and identify wetland conservation projects. Once the list of projects have been identified, the next step is finding enough match to submit the NACA grant. To be awarded a NACA grant from the federal government requires one-to-one match, and the match has to be private dollars or state dollars. So Ducks Unlimited meets with numerous landowners and state partners to identify not only projects, but enough match to submit for a NACA grant. Once enough match and projects have been identified, then we can go ahead and submit for a large NACA grant, and you can submit for a grant 2 times a year, once in March and once in July. Once you submit the Nawca grant, then the process of review is started. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Bird Conservation Habitat Council is the first group that reviews proposals. Once this group selects a group of successful proposals, those proposals are then passed to the Migratory Bird Conservation Council. This council is a group of 9 members identified by the Secretary of Interior to review and fund wetland conservation programs. Once the Migratory Bird Commission reviews and selects projects for funding, then the Fish and Wildlife Service will distribute funds to the various organizations such as Ducks Unlimited. The Nawca program has been the most successful wetland conservation program in the Intermountain West. However, funding is not guaranteed. Each year, the U.S. House Appropriations has to allocate funding for the Nawca program. This past year, as everyone knows, with the budget crisis, the Nawca program also fell victim to some of the funding cuts. As of last year, Nawca was funded at $47.6 million annually. This year, due to funding cuts, that number was cut down by about 20% to $37.6 million. This will have grave impacts to wetland conservation projects not only in Utah but across the country.
Social and political attitudes towards the wetlands have changed dramatically over the decades. For many, the prospect of wealth and commercial success guided the agendas of a large number of businesses and industrial facilities. As we've seen today, this has led to the loss of unique warm spring wetland complexes, a succession of playas and thousands of acres of brackish wetlands that ring the Great Salt Lake.
My name is Jack Ray, and I'm the Vice President of the Utah Waterfowl Association, and I'd just like to talk for a minute about the Great Salt Lake wetlands and what it used to be like 100 years ago. A lot of times when people look out across the lake, they see a largely extant lake surrounded by a fringe of wetlands, and what they don't realize is that 100 years ago the wetlands extended several miles in all directions beyond where they currently do. The reason those wetlands no longer exist is because there was never either the community will or the political will to preserve them, and as a result they've all been drained, paved over, and fallen victim to development. In news reports from around the turn of the century, on the eve of the opening of the duck season, they would talk about looking out across the marsh and it would look like a prairie fire extending many miles north and south because of all of the waterfowl hunters who had campfires in the evening out in the marshes. Those marshes are now all gone. All that remains are marshes that have been preserved by the remaining duck clubs and by a few state-managed waterfowl management areas. As a result, it's become increasingly important to preserve what we have now. Unfortunately, there are still significant risks to the wetlands that remain around the Great Salt Lake. Some of those come from piecemeal developments, such as residential developments or industrial development. Some come from large-scale projects. Likewise, on the long-term plan, the Salt Lake International Airport wants to put in a 4th runway. That would require destroying or dewatering an additional 600 and some odd acres of wetlands. That's the equivalent of something like 60 downtown city blocks in Salt Lake City. So if you think of that magnitude of impact in some of the most productive marshes that are at the heart of some of the most vibrant ecosystems in the western United States, it's a real tragedy. For that reason, programs like Nawca are extremely important to enable us to preserve what remains and to preserve these wonderful treasures both for the wildlife as well as for generations of Utahns who have enjoyed them for over a century. Over a century ago, Utah had a very strong connection to its wetland systems. Utah was one of the first states to establish state-acquired and state-managed waterfowl management areas because waterfowl hunting was so popular in the state of Utah. In fact, newspapers at the time considered it what they called the national sport of Utah, and there was a very strong connection. And waterfowl from the Great Salt Lake fed a significant part of the population of the Wasatch Front. There continues to be a strong connection to those wetlands among the waterfowling community and increasingly also among the non-waterfowling community. And if we can preserve the remaining wetlands, we can preserve one of the world's truly unique ecosystems on into the future indefinitely.
There exist many opportunities to become actively involved in promoting wetlands conservation. Being aware of policy issues that arise in government, becoming informed of local laws and policies, writing state and federal representatives about continued funding of federal and state protections, such as Nawca, are several ways of joining efforts to protect wetlands. Participating in marshland maintenance, nest box construction, and increasing awareness in schools and in the community are additional examples of becoming involved. Many who have experienced the wonder of this fragile ecosystem find this new appreciation nurtures a desire to preserve these wetlands, not only for present generations, but for many to come. One of the greatest American environmentalists of the 20th century, Aldo Leopold, in his essay entitled Goose Music, wrote, "If then we can live without goose music, we may as well do away with stars, or sunsets, or Iliads. But the point is that we would be fools to do away with any of them. And when the dawn wind stirs through the ancient cottonwoods, and the gray light steals down the hills over the old river, sliding softly past its white brown sandbars, what if there be no more goose music? Hopefully, the continuation of programs like Nawca, we never have to answer that question."